All right, welcome back to episode 3 of chapter 3, and I'm going to wrap up this chapter on culture in the last handful of slides talking about multiculturalism. So let's get a basic definition: a perspective recognizing the cultural diversity of the United States and promoting respect and equal standing for all cultural traditions. Now, sometimes what we want to do and what we want to get done is not always how it manifests in real life. So those are our intentions, right? We talked about that difference between real and ideal culture last time. And oftentimes, though, throughout history, the United States has really downplayed cultural diversity and has chosen time and time again to define itself in terms of its European immigrants, especially the English. So we're going to look, when we talk about multiculturalism, at two different ideas. One is dominant, or being dominant in a society or a culture as a human being, and being disadvantaged, and what those look like in a sort of formal social ways, maybe a little bit different than what we might know. So, question here, is racism, prejudice, and discrimination still a problem in the United States? Minor problem, or major problem, minor problem, not at all. So let's bring in some data from last semester to take a look at that. Ooh. All right. To really know what our group looks like in as far as who voted and what were those people like and how they perceive this question. We don't know that, but we can at least get an idea that we know that we have a lot of challenges, and not just right now, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and certainly 20 years, 50 years from now, as far as race relations are concerned. Is racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the United States getting worse, improving, staying the same, and for who? And you can answer that for yourself, but I think that we know more than ever right now, and I have been doing race relations work for the last 25 years, and I would say that this is the most intense time that I've ever experienced, where people are really moving in the direction of making changes to institutions that we know have needed a great deal of change for a long time, particularly in regards to race and our history of racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the United States. So let's look at our definition of minority and majority group according to sociologists. So majority group: any group that is dominant in society, any group that enjoys more than its proportionate share of wealth, power, and social status. So not some, but a great deal more than what would be proportionate to others. Usually a majority group is in a position to dominate or exercise power over other groups, and oftentimes they do. Minority group: any group that is assigned an inferior status in society, a group that has less than its proportionate share of wealth, power, social status, and often minority group members are discriminated against by those in the majority. And a lot of times the discrimination that takes place has been institutionalized and rationalized for long periods of time so that it seems like that's the way it should be. And of course, that's sort of the power or the purpose of the dominant group when they start to exercise that power over the disadvantaged group or the minority group. So majority minority groups, oftentimes determined by race or ethnicity, could also be gender, physical disability, or physical ability or differing levels of ability, relationship orientation or sexual orientation, however you're sort of defining that. And we'll talk about that later this semester for sure. But we have to understand that the social usage is different from a common numerical usage. Okay, so if we were to look at South Africa, we would know that a minority group of people would be people of European descent, but they are a majority or dominant in as far as their disproportionate share of power. Same is true here. The social usage is different than numerical usages because we know that women are a greater number, 51, 52% of the population, yet they are not the dominant group in as far as gender, because women make 76% of men's wages. We know this only until recently, where it's been voted upon to level that playing field, but how that will really look will take a while to manifest. So important to keep in mind that a group's role and status, not its numbers, make it a minority majority group. What is that power relationship? That's the real important part there. So majority equals dominant, minority for our use here in sociology equals subordinate. And we could make a list, as we often do, of who is in each group. So who is minorities? Women, people of color. I would say we could look at age and say those that are really young or those that are really old would not be in that dominant group. All sort of other things that we could put. Dominant group, usually people who identify as a gender male, usually people of European descent. And we can break that down. People who are in the right age group, people with no discernible disabilities or a high level of physical ability, whatever that might be. So anyway, we understand that, there are different ways that we can explain this and look at this in sociology, and we will. So multiculturalism, e pluribus unum, out of many one. I think this motto not only symbolizes our national political union, but also this idea that the varied experiences of immigrants from all the way around the world, when people are here, come together to form new ways of life. So I talked about cultural pluralism, and that's you start to understand somebody else from their perspective, and the lens grows and it gets bigger, right? That roadmap, it's like all of a sudden it expands. Same thing is true, and that's why diversity is such a fantastic piece, because you have so much more input, so many more different perspectives, and most of us solve problems not in an individual way, even though we sell that idea of rugged individualism, particularly in this culture, but we get it done with community, friends and family and people we know, and that goes from our first job all the way through life. So you probably heard that idea, right? America's a melting pot. I think that's an older type of an idea. And this is the difference really between assimilation and pluralism or relativism. If we look at it as a melting pot, then everything sort of melts together and is like that thing. But usually that thing, if it was a melting pot, would be dominant culture. So be more like us or assimilate. If we think of it more like a salad, right, than a melting pot, and I know, it's just these random ideas, but I do think this works, and that's you could taste the onions and the pepperoncinis, I like pepperoncinis, and Parmesan cheese, and now I'm getting hungry, but you know what I mean? Like, it's all, you taste all those things, but they're also together. Again, that's the idea of pluralism. Everybody maintains and retains their own identity rather than having to assimilate to dominant culture. And oftentimes dominant culture isn't ready for pluralism or relativism. They want people to assimilate to be like them. And we can look back every step of the way in this country with Native Americans and colonialism and people coming here from different countries and the sort of long-standing history of be like us instead of share what you bring to this table in the United States or this culture that really makes things more diverse and even more amazing. So a couple ideas. So if we look at multiculturalism, for a long time, and these are our textbooks that are still being used, and the way that people even have made their maps from a very Eurocentric point of view, from an English and European point of view. And now we know that that's different. Howard Zinn, amazing sociologist, People's History of the United States, really set that straight. But we know that Columbus didn't discover America. And as a matter of fact, I believe he was incarcerated several times by the Queen and just wasn't a very successful guy. We celebrate this individual until we find out, what is that real piece of history, not from a Eurocentric view or a Eurocentric cultural pattern, European sort of cultural pattern dominant idea. And that's, I believe, again, what we're doing more of right now. Let's take an honest look at history rather than a revisionist sort of Eurocentric view. Language, same thing, controversial issue. Some people believe English should be the official language. Of course, we have so many languages in a multicultural society. Should bilingual education be mandatory in United States schools? This is just for you to think about, yes or no. The first thing that always pops into my mind, because I love basketball, is that so many of the NBA players speak 3, 4, or 5 languages, and just how much language is connected to the learning centers in the brain. But sometimes even things like this can be a very controversial issue. So we've talked about Eurocentrism, and now we'll get to ethnocentrism, right? Ethnocentrism is the practice of judging another culture by the standards of one's own culture. So what I was saying before with cultural relativism or cultural pluralism is that instead of assuming that your own culture is like just the superior way of life and that's the way to do it, and of course people exhibit this everywhere. I mean, we are taught to value our culture. I remember when my boys were really little, they were so proud to sing the national anthem, do the Pledge of Allegiance, and that whole thing. And I mean, that's fantastic. It serves a purpose, a functional purpose too. But assuming that that's the only way or the best way, that's that ethnocentric piece. And then that's when we're not considering things sociologically from other people's perspectives. So you can give examples, I'm sure, on how ethnocentrism can generate misunderstanding and conflict. We can look at the racism that has hit our very own CSU campus semester after semester after semester, until last semester, and it was a really big meeting that was going to take place from students of color and faculty members and the president to really address how do we enforce keeping things safe for people of color on campus, because every single semester somebody does something like hang a paper towel noose outside somebody's door or paint their face black. We know about this. So my idea, or at least my hope, is that we're using a more culturally relativistic or pluralistic view on campus. We start to understand cultures more, and then there's just no place and no room for that type of discrimination on our campus. I know that's not any of my students. All right. So cultural relativism or pluralism is the practice of judging a culture by its own standards, okay? That's the alternative to the idea that you're right all the time. And a lot of times you've got to be able to be open to unfamiliar values and norms, and you've got to put together some of your, or at least aside some of your own cultural standards we've known our whole lives. That being said, a lot of people embrace that. Instead of fearing that, it's like, wow, I get a chance to experience yet another set of viewpoints, another culture, more companionship, different food, all of the things that diversity brings to the table. So it pays for us to have an open or culturally relativistic or pluralistic viewpoint. And certainly as sociologists, being able to cultivate that with the sociological perspective that I was talking about in chapter 1, really important to us and a ton of benefits for you throughout your life. So relativism, cultural relativism, a worldview whereby we understand the practice of another society sociologically in terms of that society's own norms, values, not our own, a little more perspective. An etic perspective, that is the perspective of the outside observer, and then we need to understand that we are on the outside, and that we do have biases. And emic perspective, the perspective of the insider belonging to that particular cultural group. So if you've ever traveled or put yourself or been in a situation where you are not the dominant group, you are not in the majority, you'll find that your experience is quite different. And we need to find more of those instances, whether that's simulations done by people like Jane Elliott, now people are finding out about her more than ever, or whether that's listening to important people of color lecture on the subject, which is even more important. So understanding things from knowing you're on the outside or being on the inside of that. You can just take a look at this on your own. This is applying theory to all the 3 different paradigms: structural functionalist, social conflict, and or social biology, at least viewpoint for here. All right, that's going to wrap it up for chapter 3. We will talk a great deal this semester about race, race relations, dominant, disadvantaged, power, access. They are things that keep coming up time and time again. So I know, whatever. Or, He-Man, I'll get you. Hey, be good people and do good things. Don't be like Skeletor. Take it away.